I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed to me.
A sudden clash inside the royal circle has erupted into a spectacle no one saw coming, as King Charles III reportedly draws a firm line against Laura Lopes amid a growing jewelry controversy. For years, delicate matters were handled behind palace doors, shielded by tradition and quiet compromise. But now, whispers of entitlement, legacy, and authority are spilling into the open, unsettling, long-standing dynamics. How did a private disagreement escalate into a moment powerful enough to command the king's direct intervention? Stay with us. The night the crown turned on itself. On March 20th, 2026, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace shifted from ceremony to quiet panic, as a decision from King Charles III sent shockwaves through both the monarchy and the watching world. What began as a grand state visit honoring dignitaries from Nigeria quickly unraveled into a scandal so strange it blurred the line between strategy and sabotage. At the center of it all was a jewel, the Star of Abuja, a rare emerald brooch presented only hours earlier as a symbol of unity. By midnight, it had vanished. Yet this was never just about a missing artifact. The whispers that followed carried something far more dangerous. A carefully staged attempt to shift suspicion onto Catherine, Princess of Wales, the future queen. Inside the palace's yellow drawing room, where elegance had defined the evening, a quiet storm had already taken shape. Security logs later revealed a precise moment, 10:40 p.m., when a restricted door was opened using a high-level biometric override. The detail might have gone unnoticed, if not for one undeniable fact. Catherine was seated in full public view, surrounded by hundreds of guests and cameras broadcasting across continents. Still, evidence began to appear where it should not have existed. A silk handkerchief bearing Catherine's initials was found placed with unsettling precision beside the empty case. It felt less like a mistake and more like a message. By dawn, selective leaks to the press painted a troubling portrait of confusion and instability, subtly framing Catherine as overwhelmed and unpredictable. Then came the twist no one expected. In the early hours, Laura Lopes stepped forward at Clarence's house, offering a confession that raised more questions than answers. She claimed the act was careless, driven by intoxication, a simple lapse of judgment. But the story didn't hold. It was Princess Anne who cut through the illusion. Known for her sharp discipline and unwavering loyalty to the institution, she dismantled the narrative piece by piece. The timelines didn't match. The access required did not align. And most damning of all, the physical data tied to the security breach pointed elsewhere entirely. By sunrise, the crisis had transformed into something deeper, a fracture within the royal structure itself. What unfolded was not just a scandal of theft, but a collision of power, loyalty, and reputation. And as the palace closed ranks under heightened security, one question lingered in every corner of the world. Was this a failed deception, or the beginning of something far more deliberate? Inside Buckingham Palace, tension crackled quietly but intensely. What secrets did Princess Anne's tablet reveal, and how could a single document, capturing a hidden act by Queen Camilla, challenge loyalty, trust, and the very image of the House of Windsor? The morning the silence broke at Buckingham Palace. Inside Buckingham Palace, an unusual tension hung in the air, sharp, watchful, and quietly explosive. What happened behind those closed doors would soon ripple far beyond the palace, challenging the very image of the House of Windsor. Princess Anne, renowned for her unyielding precision, entered the king's private study clutching a digital tablet. The file it contained was set to redefine loyalty, trust, and power within the royal family. The document, marked Tactical Surveillance, Hallway B, revealed more than anyone in that room had anticipated. Thermal imaging captured a figure whose movements and posture mirrored Queen Camilla, discreetly concealing an unusual object beneath the layered fabric of her state gown. It was not just suspicion anymore, it was evidence, clear and impossible to dismiss. For years, King Charles had maintained a careful balance, quietly shielding Camilla's family from the sharper scrutiny once exercised by Queen Elizabeth II and even Anne herself. But this moment erased that protection completely. By 10:42 a.m., the tension reached its breaking point. A sharp crash, reportedly a shattered crystal inkwell, cut through the room as the king's restraint finally gave way. His words, directed at Camilla and her daughter Laura Lopes, carried the weight of accusation and finality. This was no longer a private disagreement. It was a confrontation tied to allegations of betrayal, manipulation, and damage to the future of the crown itself. Hours later, at approximately 3:30 p.m., the consequences became visible. Laura Lopes was quietly escorted out through a rear gate, her departure swift and without ceremony. No farewells followed, only the cold efficiency of royal protocol in crisis. What made the situation even more unsettling was the presence of an international delegation, including representatives from Nigeria, who had arrived expecting diplomacy but instead witnessed a deeply internal unraveling. Behind the scenes, the fallout accelerated. Camilla's name began disappearing from official records, her patronages suspended, and dozens of affiliated charities instructed to distance themselves within days. Yet perhaps most troubling were the discoveries tied to Room 1844, documents suggesting deeper intentions, including alleged alterations that raised unsettling questions about the king's own legacy. What happened that day was more than a scandal. It marked a turning point, a moment when modern surveillance, internal rivalry, and long-suppressed tensions collided. And as silence once again settled over the palace, it no longer felt like tradition. It felt like the aftermath of something far from over. Within the palace, a new force was quietly taking hold. Law, measured and unyielding, replacing tradition's unquestioned authority. What caused this shift, and how would rules long ignored now challenge the monarchy's carefully maintained order and reshape the power dynamics behind closed doors? The night the emerald shook the crown. A line has been crossed, not with noise or public spectacle, but with something far more enduring: law. Within palace walls, where quiet understanding once guided every decision, a different force is now at work. It is measured, documented, and grounded in rules that cannot simply be brushed aside. For generations, the monarchy functioned in a world where tradition carried authority on its own, where expectations were rarely questioned and agreements did not need to be written to be respected. That familiar rhythm is now facing a quiet but undeniable challenge. What makes this moment striking is its quiet power. No drama, yet legal precision replaces tradition, bringing accountability. Documented rights and financial clarity now guide decisions once shaped by custom, marking a fundamental, undeniable shift, even if the changes remain largely unseen by the public. At the center of this shift stands Prince Edward, a figure long known for his calm and understated presence. He has never been one to command headlines or seek attention, yet his approach in this situation carries a quiet strength. Without altering his nature, he has introduced something the institution cannot easily ignore: a position built not on emotion or influence, but on carefully prepared facts and legal standing. It is a move that does not disrupt loudly, but it compels a response nonetheless. This is what makes the situation so different from anything that came before. It is no longer simply about internal arrangements or long-held privileges. Instead, it raises a deeper question about how tradition holds up when placed beside clear legal boundaries. For an institution that has always valued control and privacy, this presents a unique test. The usual methods of managing issues quietly may no longer be enough when documentation speaks with such authority. If the matter were to grow beyond its current boundaries, the effects could be far-reaching. Public attention would intensify, and long-standing assumptions about the untouchable nature of royal affairs could begin to weaken. Even without full visibility, the idea that such a challenge exists is powerful in itself. It signals that the structure, no matter how established, is not immune to scrutiny. In the end, whether handled behind closed doors or brought into wider awareness, the message is already clear. The balance between tradition and law has shifted, and once that shift takes place, it rarely returns to its original form. At 7:30 a.m. on March 20th, 2026, a quiet message hinted that Catherine might be cracking under pressure. But how did this seemingly small dispute over an emerald spiral into a series of revelations no one within the palace could control? The whisper that shook the crown. At precisely 7:30 a.m. on March 20th, 2026, a quiet stream of messages slipped from a private office into powerful media circles, carrying a subtle but dangerous idea that Catherine had begun to unravel under the weight of her future. It looked harmless at first, almost routine, but within hours, it would ignite a chain of revelations no one inside the palace walls could contain. What seemed like a dispute over a single emerald quickly unraveled into something far more calculated. Princess Anne, known for her unflinching composure, stepped forward not with emotion, but with evidence. The intercepted communications told a story of careful narrative shaping, where reputation became a weapon and doubt was planted with precision. This was no accident. It was a strategy. For King Charles, the moment struck deeper than protocol. Years of integrating Camilla's family into the royal fold now seemed fragile and exploited. What he faced was no longer misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to shape the monarchy's future for present gain. By 3:30 p.m., the decision arrived with chilling clarity. Laura Lopes was formally removed under a sovereign exclusion protocol. The transition was swift, surgical, leaving behind an eerie silence in rooms that had just witnessed the collapse of trust, marking a turning point few could ignore. Yet the most unsettling discovery was still hidden, waiting to surface. At 5 p.m., as security teams swept through the private quarters, a concealed compartment in room 1844 revealed something far more dangerous than any missing jewel. Inside lay a second version of the king's private will, unauthorized, meticulously crafted, and impossible to dismiss. Printed on restricted crown paper, it carried alterations in unmistakable midnight blue ink. The changes were precise. Nearly 18% of the king's personal treasury, along with key heritage assets, had been redirected toward a private trust tied to Camilla's lineage. This was no longer about image or influence. It had crossed into calculated financial manipulation at the highest level. In that moment, the earlier scandal, the so-called Star of Abuja, began to look less like the main event and more like a carefully placed distraction. What unfolded within those walls was not just a fracture of loyalty, but a revelation of intent. And as the weight of it settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was never just about a jewel. It was about control. A message quietly shook the monarchy, turning a state visit into a tense standoff. What caused this sudden crisis, and how would a formal diplomatic complaint from Nigeria threaten to expose the palace's hidden fractures? The crown under fire. A palace crisis unfolds. A message arrived that quietly shook the very core of the monarchy, transforming what was meant to be a proud display of unity during a high-profile state visit into something far more serious. Beneath the polished smiles and formal greetings, a storm was already brewing, one that threatened to expose deep fractures within the palace walls. By noon, as the great clocks of Buckingham Palace echoed through its halls, the atmosphere had shifted. The celebration had turned into a tense standoff. A formal diplomatic complaint from Nigeria demanded answers, clear, immediate, and public. At the center of it all was a missing emerald brooch, a sovereign gift of great value and meaning. But this was no simple case of misplacement. The issue had crossed into the territory of international law, raising questions that could not be quietly handled behind closed doors. While the world focused on the missing jewel, a deeper and more troubling narrative was unfolding. At 6:15 p.m., Princess Anne reportedly presented findings to King Charles III that shifted everything. What seemed like a scandal targeting Catherine, Princess of Wales, was now believed to be a carefully designed distraction. Beneath it lay suspicions of financial misconduct on a much larger scale, an operation that threatened the very legacy of the crown. The king's reaction, according to insiders, was not just shock, but a deep sense of betrayal. Trust, once given against earlier warnings from Queen Elizabeth II, now appears to have been misplaced. The response was swift and decisive. 3 senior figures connected to Camilla, Queen Consort's private office, were stripped of their positions and removed from palace grounds. Security systems were reviewed, and access points once considered secure were now treated as possible entryways for internal compromise. At the same time, law enforcement took an extraordinary step. The Metropolitan Police's Diplomatic Protection Unit opened a formal investigation, effectively turning parts of the palace into an active crime scene. What made the situation even more explosive was the emergence of digital leaks, messages allegedly originating from within the palace itself. These leaks attempted to shift blame onto Catherine, suggesting instability, a claim that only intensified the crisis. During a private meeting later that morning, Nigeria's president reportedly confronted the king with these findings. His message was firm. Their nation's gift was not meant to be used in a calculated internal conflict. In that moment, what had started as a royal misunderstanding transformed into a full-scale institutional reckoning, one where reputation, trust, and legacy all hung in the balance. In the early hours, a high-stakes plan quietly unfolded within palace walls. But what drove this risky strategy? And how would Laura Lopes' unexpected role shape a crisis tied to the Nigerian fallout before the world even noticed? The crisis that redefined royal power. In the quiet hours before dawn, when decisions are usually hidden from the public eye, a frantic strategy was unfolding behind palace walls. At exactly 2:14 a.m., a risky move was set into motion, one that would soon deepen an already fragile situation. Laura Lopes was drawn into the spotlight, not as a central figure of authority, but as a shield meant to soften the growing outrage tied to the Nigerian fallout. The intention seemed simple on the surface: present the matter as a private family misfortune and quietly resolve it through a discreet financial settlement offered to Nigeria. But what was expected to calm tensions instead ignited something far more serious. The Nigerian delegation refused outright. To them, the proposal was not diplomacy. It was disrespect. The idea of shifting responsibility onto Laura only reinforced their belief that the issue was being mishandled at its core. At that moment, the palace lost its room to maneuver. By 1:45 p.m. later that same day, a decisive shift had taken place. King Charles authorized a sweeping restriction, an immediate halt to any communication between Queen Camilla's household and foreign representatives. It was not just a precaution, it was a signal. The monarchy was choosing preservation over loyalty. Princess Anne, known for her firm approach, stepped forward as the executor of this transition, meeting directly with Nigeria's High Commissioner. Armed with evidence, she demonstrated that internal accountability was no longer being avoided, but enforced with precision. Even so, the cost of containing the fallout was immense. While a complete diplomatic breakdown was narrowly avoided, the damage to Queen Camilla's public standing became undeniable. Conversations within royal circles quietly turned toward possibilities once considered unthinkable. Among them was the idea of a formal separation, not for personal reasons, but as a strategic necessity under international expectations tied to the Diplomatic Assets Act. In the days that followed, actions spoke louder than statements. Laura Lopes' removal was carried out with striking finality, symbolizing a broader effort to distance the crown from any perceived influence of the Parker Bowles circle. Meanwhile, nearly 48 charities and global patronages began suspending their ties, reflecting how far-reaching the consequences had become. Nigeria's position remained firm, reportedly calling for a clear and lasting gesture of accountability, including restricting Camilla from future Commonwealth engagements. As the second day of the state visit faded into evening, one reality stood above all others. The monarchy was no longer managing a temporary crisis, but confronting a transformation. And at its center was a decision that could reshape its future: quiet exile, framed as necessity rather than choice. At 4:30 p.m., what began as quiet diplomacy erupted into irreversible fallout. How did a shortened Nigerian delegation, a 52.4-carat emerald, and whispers of a forged will push King Charles III and the monarchy to a breaking point? The Crown, at the edge of silence. At exactly 4:30 p.m., the mood shifted from quiet diplomacy to irreversible fallout as the delegation from Nigeria abruptly shortened its visit, leaving behind more than a returned jewel. They left behind a fracture no ceremony could repair. Inside Buckingham Palace, the weight of a 52.4-carat emerald and whispers of a forged will pressed heavily on a monarchy already walking a fragile line between tradition and public trust. By early evening on March 20, 2026, King Charles III stood in reflective stillness, watching the convoy disappear into the distance. In that moment, he was no longer simply a sovereign or a husband. He was a ruler confronting the collapse of a decades-long bond now overshadowed by allegations too serious to ignore. The idea of quiet resolution had already slipped away. Across the city at Kensington Palace, the atmosphere was strikingly different, controlled, distant, almost surgical. Prince William was not waiting for events to unfold. He was actively reshaping them. Leading an urgent legal session tied to the Duchy of Cornwall, he reportedly placed before his father a choice that would define the monarchy's immediate future. This was no longer a private family dispute. It had evolved into something far more consequential. At the center of the storm stood Queen Camilla, whose position had become increasingly untenable. The discovery of a forged document, allegedly redirecting a portion of royal assets, transformed suspicion into a direct challenge against the institution itself. For William, this crossed a line that could not be negotiated. Loyalty to the crown, in his view, could not coexist with unresolved allegations of deceit. Meanwhile, Catherine, Princess of Wales, maintained a silence that spoke volumes. Her absence from public unity sent a message clearer than any formal statement. This was a moment demanding accountability, not appearances. Her stance quietly amplified the urgency of the crisis, reinforcing the growing divide within the royal household. What unfolded behind closed doors was not merely a disagreement, but the early stages of a constitutional reckoning. The possibility of a formal separation involving a reigning monarch, something unseen in centuries, began to feel less like speculation and more like an approaching reality. Time, once an ally of royal discretion, had become its greatest pressure. Behind the palace walls, tensions that once seemed quiet have erupted into a full-blown crisis. What drove the royal family to consider drastic measures? And could the looming choice to strip Camilla of titles reshape the monarchy's future forever? A palace decision that could change everything. Behind the guarded walls of the monarchy, a storm is unfolding with a force few had predicted, and at its center stands a decision that could redraw the future of the royal family forever. What once seemed like quiet internal disagreements has now grown into a full crisis, fueled by the fallout from the Nigerian diplomatic incident and the growing demand for accountability both inside and outside the palace. Three possible paths have quietly taken shape within royal circles, each more dramatic than the last. The most severe option is a complete legal separation, one that would formally end the marriage and remove Camilla from every royal title and privilege. Supporters of this path believe it would satisfy a public still unsettled by recent revelations, but it carries a dangerous risk, opening the door to a fierce legal battle that could expose long-hidden private exchanges. Yet this is not the outcome currently seen as most likely. Palace advisors have leaned toward a quieter solution, one framed around health concerns. Under this plan, Camilla would step away permanently from royal duties, her name gradually disappearing from official records, her public presence fading without the spectacle of a courtroom. By early evening, discussions around this option had reached an estimated 70% likelihood, though public pressure continues to challenge its viability. A third, more discreet alternative has also been considered. This route would involve a confidential agreement, trading silence for protection. In this scenario, potential legal consequences tied to the alleged theft of the Star of Abuja and questions surrounding official documents would be set aside in exchange for strict, lifelong discretion. While some senior figures favor this approach to shield the institution, others see it as far too lenient. Tensions reached a breaking point at approximately 7:15 p.m. when a private exchange between the King and the Prince of Wales reportedly shifted everything. The message delivered was firm and left little room for compromise. By that moment, dozens of charitable organizations had already begun distancing themselves, quietly removing associations that once seemed permanent. Public sentiment, measured earlier that same day around 5:30 p.m., revealed overwhelming support for a full investigation, signaling that the monarchy could no longer rely on silence or tradition to contain the situation. Even past decisions, particularly long-standing leniency towards certain family members, have resurfaced, now viewed as missteps that contributed to the current crisis. As night falls, one reality becomes clear. The path chosen will not only determine Camilla's fate, but will shape the monarchy's credibility for years to come. The House of Windsor may have removed its most divisive figure, but a heavier silence remains. What secret shifts unfolded behind Buckingham Palace walls, and how did March 20th, 2026, mark the end of an era that reshaped loyalty, power, and consequence at the monarchy's core? The night the crown chose survival over silence. The House of Windsor has erased its most divisive figure, yet the silence left behind feels heavier than any scandal. Behind the guarded walls of Buckingham Palace, a quiet but ruthless shift has taken hold, one that has redrawn loyalty, power, and consequence at the very heart of the monarchy. On the rain-soaked evening of March 20th, 2026, at exactly 8:45 p.m., the gates of Ray Mill House in Wiltshire sealed shut, marking not just a departure, but the end of an era that had long tested the limits of royal patience. Hours earlier, at 3:30 p.m., King Charles III signed an order that would ripple far beyond a single removal. What followed was swift and unyielding. 12 senior palace officials were dismissed without ceremony, their access revoked instantly, as if the institution itself had decided to cleanse every trace of a growing internal crisis. This was no quiet reshuffle, it was a calculated reset. At the center of the storm stood the mystery of a 52.4-carat emerald, known as the Star of Abuja, quietly returned under tight diplomatic security to the Nigerian High Commission. Yet its journey left scars. Nigeria's demand for formal acknowledgement of failure has placed the monarchy under rare international pressure, turning what might have been contained into a global reckoning. Elsewhere, deeper secrets were locked away. A forged will, traced to a distinctive midnight blue signature, now sits sealed for 99 years within the National Archives. It is less a document and more a warning, silent, permanent, and impossible to ignore. Investigators had already swept through Buckingham Palace, uncovering the layers of access and betrayal that made such deception possible. Inside the palace, the consequences were immediate. Advisors tied to the scandal were quietly escorted out, while Princess Anne took control with cold precision, ordering a full audit of royal assets dating back to the coronation. Rumors now swirl that the emerald may not have been the only item to vanish under watch. Even family ties were not spared. Laura Lopes faced a historic exclusion order, barring her from royal grounds for a decade, an unmistakable signal that personal loyalty would no longer outweigh institutional survival. Meanwhile, King Charles retreated into near silence, isolating himself as decisions once delayed were finally enforced. Guided by Prince William and Princess Anne, a new doctrine has emerged, one that places the crown above all else. In its wake, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, moves through the palace free from the shadows that once followed her. The monarchy endures, but not unchanged. What remains is a crown intact, yet carried by a house forever altered. So what do you think led King Charles III to shut down Laura Lopes over a royal jewelry clash? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe.